For 9 long years, the body of Jason Clark lay hidden beneath the cold stones of a quiet stream in Yellowstone. No one knew that just steps away from where thousands of visitors stopped to take photos and marvel at the park's wild beauty, a dark and chilling secret was buried. During those 9 years, Tom Harris, the last man to see Jason alive, lived as a grieving friend. He told everyone that Jason had mysteriously vanished during their hiking trip. He shared stories, even creating a small documentary to honor the best friend he claimed had been swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. Tom became the face of loss, a symbol of friendship cruelly cut short by tragedy. But nature cannot keep its secrets forever. When the ice melted, when the stream receded and the stones shifted, the truth was finally revealed. And that truth was nothing like what Tom had described. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragic misstep. What was uncovered painted a much darker picture, a murder carefully concealed for nearly a decade. The camera discovered beside Jason's remains did not capture Yellowstone's grandeur. Instead, it held the horrifying final moments of a man betrayed by the very person he trusted most. And from that moment, Jason Clark's disappearance transformed from a tragic mystery into one of the park's most haunting stories of betrayal and death. Jason Clark was not the kind of man people expected to vanish. He was 36 years old, fit, and full of life. He had built a reputation among his friends and co-workers as someone dependable, trustworthy, and always willing to lend a hand. He worked long hours in a small construction company back home, saving up each year for a single big trip that allowed him to escape the monotony of everyday life. Yellowstone had been on his list for years, a vast wilderness he had only seen in photographs, a place he dreamed of exploring with his own eyes. When the spring of that year finally arrived, Jason decided that time had come. He told his family he would spend a week hiking and camping in the park, reconnecting with nature and pushing himself beyond the daily grind. What no one could have predicted was that he would not be going alone. Tom Harris, a man Jason had known since college, had volunteered to join. To everyone else, Tom seemed like a natural companion, outdoorsy, friendly, and eager to share the adventure. But what lay beneath that facade was something far darker, something even Jason himself had failed to notice. The two men planned their trip carefully, at least on the surface. They packed light but carried what they thought were essentials: tents, sleeping bags, dehydrated meals, and a camera to capture their journey. Jason was particularly excited about the camera, hoping to film the geysers, the vast canyons, and maybe even a glimpse of the wildlife that roamed freely through the park. His family remembered the way his eyes lit up when he described what he hoped to see: the hot springs, the rivers, the untouched stretches of wilderness where one could almost feel transported back in time. On the first days of the trip, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Other hikers later reported seeing two men along one of the backcountry trails, sharing laughs, appearing relaxed. Jason sent a short message from a visitor center before they left the main roads behind. Heading deeper in today. Talk soon. That was the last anyone heard from him. Tom's version of events, repeated countless times in the years that followed, painted a picture of misfortune. According to him, Jason had wandered ahead on a narrow trail near a stream. The terrain was rocky. The sun was beginning to set, and in one brief moment, Jason slipped out of sight. Tom claimed he searched frantically, calling his name, but there was no response. Darkness fell quickly in the valley, and by the next morning, Jason was simply gone. Authorities treated Tom as a cooperative witness at the time. He guided search teams back to the area where he claimed Jason had disappeared. Dogs scoured the terrain, helicopters circled overhead, and volunteers combed through brush and rock, but nothing turned up. Jason had simply evaporated into Yellowstone's unforgiving wilderness. To Jason's family, it was heartbreaking but believable. People got lost in national parks every year. Some fell to injury or exposure, and their remains were never recovered. Why should Jason's case be any different? But hindsight changes everything. What once seemed like an unfortunate accident began to look very different when the truth surfaced nearly a decade later. The camera, the bones, the carefully placed rocks. all suggested that Jason's final trip into Yellowstone was never meant to end with him coming home. In the days immediately following Jason Clark's disappearance, Yellowstone National Park turned into the stage of a desperate search. The moment Tom Harris reported that his friend had vanished, rangers mobilized. They were used to dealing with hikers who lost their way, but this case had a different weight to it. Jason had seemingly disappeared within minutes, and Tom's story that he had simply walked ahead and never returned raised alarms that something more serious might have happened. Search and rescue teams were deployed quickly. Helicopters thumped overhead, circling above the rugged terrain where Tom claimed Jason had last been seen. From the sky, the vast forests and rocky streams stretched endlessly, a reminder of how easy it was for a single person to vanish. On the ground, dogs trained to pick up human scent combed the area, their handlers calling Jason's name over and over into the silence. Volunteers, locals, hikers, even tourists offered their help, forming search lines that pushed deeper into the backcountry. The terrain was unforgiving. The ground was uneven, riddled with sharp boulders and thick undergrowth. Snow still clung stubbornly to the shaded slopes, making paths slippery and treacherous. Streams were swollen with meltwater, rushing fiercely as spring gave way to summer. Every step carried the possibility of danger, and every shadow seemed to hide a secret. Yet despite the intensity of the search, not a single trace of Jason was found. Tom Harris was present through it all, walking alongside rangers, shaking his head in disbelief, playing the role of a grieving friend. He recounted the story again and again. Jason slipped ahead, disappeared into the fading light, and was gone. He described the spot carefully, led teams back to the stream, pointed out where he thought Jason had last stood. The details never varied, which, at the time, gave weight to his account. Investigators saw a man devastated, cooperating fully, doing everything he could to help. No one had reason to doubt him. As the days turned into a week, frustration set in. The search expanded outward, covering miles of wilderness. Rangers checked steep ravines, caves, and dense clusters of pine trees where someone could have collapsed unseen. Helicopters used infrared technology at night to detect heat signatures in case Jason was alive but unable to move. Still, nothing. It was as though the earth had swallowed him whole. Jason's family arrived at the park, clinging to hope. They walked the trails themselves, calling his name, leaving notes and bright pieces of cloth on branches as markers, desperate for him to stumble across something if he was still alive. Each night they gathered at the ranger station, waiting for news that never came. Tom stayed close to them, offering words of comfort, positioning himself as the one who had shared Jason's final hours. His grief looked genuine, his despair convincing. After 10 days, the official search was scaled back. Rangers explained gently to the family that survival beyond that point was unlikely. Exposure, dehydration, or injury, any of these could have claimed Jason in the unforgiving backcountry. Without evidence of foul play, the case was classified as a tragic disappearance, one of many that had occurred in Yellowstone over the decades. But what no one could know then was that the very man standing at the center of the search, the man who had cried alongside Jason's family, was hiding the truth. The search had ended not because the wilderness was too vast, but because the person guiding the searchers was the one who had ensured they would never find Jason alive. When the official search ended, the wilderness of Yellowstone swallowed its secret whole. The helicopters stopped circling, the scent dogs were led back to their kennels, and the volunteers returned to their daily lives. But for Jason Clark's family, the silence that followed was far heavier than the frantic noise of the search itself. They went home with more questions than answers. His mother kept Jason's room exactly as it had been, refusing to move a single thing. His father, quiet and stoic, spent hours poring over maps of Yellowstone, tracing trails with his fingers, wondering which bend in the river or which rocky slope might still hold his son. His sister often returned to the park in the summers, joining smaller volunteer efforts, pinning flyers to trailhead boards with Jason's picture smiling back. The story spread through local newspapers and even gained national attention for a short while. Another hiker gone. Another unsolved mystery in one of America's most famous parks. People speculated endlessly perhaps he had been mauled by a bear, or swept away by a rushing stream, or had fallen into a ravine so deep that no one could ever reach him. Every theory had its believers, and each carried the same cruel finality. Jason was gone, his body lost to the wilderness. Through it all, Tom Harris kept himself close to the family. He attended candlelight vigils, stood beside Jason's parents during interviews, and spoke to reporters about the heartbreak of losing his closest friend. He even produced a short documentary filled with scenic shots of Yellowstone and tearful recollections of their final trip. Viewers saw him as a man burdened by grief, doing everything he could to preserve his friend's memory. To Jason's family, Tom was not only the last person to see their son alive, but also the one who seemed to share their pain most deeply. But the years dragged on, and with each one, the hope of finding Jason alive grew fainter. Holidays became unbearable. Birthdays came and went without celebration. The Clark family learned to live with a strange kind of grief, the grief of not knowing. There was no grave to visit, no body to mourn over, only the endless question of what had really happened. Yellowstone itself seemed almost cruel in its beauty. Tourists poured in year after year, taking the same trails Jason had once walked, gazing at the same waterfalls, laughing in the same campgrounds. And yet, just beyond those postcard-perfect views, a family's agony lingered like a shadow. For them, Yellowstone was not a place of wonder, but a wound that never healed. For nearly a decade, life for the Clarks was defined by waiting for a phone call, waiting for a discovery, waiting for closure that never seemed to arrive. And all the while, the truth lay hidden under a pile of rocks by a quiet stream, untouched, undisturbed, guarded by silence, and by the man who had crafted the lie. 9 years passed before Yellowstone finally surrendered its secret. It happened in the spring, during the first real thaw after a long and brutal winter. Snowmelt rushed down the slopes, swelling streams and rivers, shifting rocks that had remained unmoved for nearly a decade. It was along one of these streams, not far from where Tom had first claimed Jason disappeared, that a group of backpackers stumbled onto something strange. At first, it was nothing more than an odd formation of stones stacked unnaturally along the water's edge. They looked as though they had been arranged by hand, not by the chaos of nature. Curious, one of the hikers knelt down and noticed something protruding between the cracks. A fragment of weathered fabric, dull and faded but undeniably out of place among the stones. When they pulled back the rocks, the discovery left them frozen in place. Beneath the stones lay human remains. The bones were fragile, discolored by years of exposure and water, but still intact enough to tell a grim story. Scattered among them were the remnants of a backpack, a rusted camp stove, and a camera sealed in a battered protective case. Authorities were called immediately. Rangers arrived, taped off the area, and carefully began the process of removing the stones. Each layer revealed more of the truth, more bones, more of Jason Clark's belongings, preserved just enough to confirm what everyone feared. The coroner would later identify the remains through dental records, leaving no doubt. After 9 years of mystery, Jason had finally been found. For his family, the news was shattering. They had long prayed for closure, yet when it arrived, it came like a knife twisting in an old wound. His mother wept when she received the call, torn between relief that he was no longer lost and anguish at the confirmation of his death. His father, once stoic, broke down for the first time in years. His sister said it felt as though time had stopped, that all the birthdays, holidays, and lonely summers had suddenly come rushing back, now with the cruel clarity of finality. The real shock, however, came with the contents of the camera. Investigators carefully retrieved the memory card, expecting scenic shots of geysers and landscapes. What they found instead were fragments of Jason's final hours. The images were blurred and chaotic shadows, rocks, and glimpses of movement. But buried within them was one chilling photo. Jason, bruised, frightened, staring directly into the lens, as though trying to leave behind a silent testimony. Standing just behind him in the frame was a figure unmistakably resembling Tom Harris. The discovery upended everything. For years, Tom had been seen as the grieving friend, the loyal witness to tragedy. Now, with the bones uncovered and the camera's damning evidence, his story unraveled. The neatly stacked rocks were not the aftermath of an accident, they were a cover, a deliberate attempt to hide Jason's body. What had once been considered a misstep or misfortune was now impossible to ignore. Jason Clark had not died by chance. He had been killed. The news rippled through the community and beyond. The Clark family was devastated all over again, this time by betrayal. The man they had leaned on, the man who had stood beside them at vigils and spoken of Jason with tears in his eyes, had been standing over Jason's grave all along. And yet, questions remained. Why had Tom done it? What had led two friends into the wilderness, only for one to return alive and the other to be buried beneath stones? The answers lay in the years of lies Tom had spun, and in the evidence now carefully collected from that lonely stream in Yellowstone. The revelation that Jason Clark had been buried under rocks and the damning photograph that appeared to show Tom Harris at the scene shifted the case from tragedy to homicide. But even with the remains uncovered, investigators faced a labyrinth of questions. Why had Tom killed his closest friend? What had really happened during those final hours in Yellowstone? And how had he managed to maintain his elaborate deception for nearly a decade? Forensic experts began piecing together what little evidence remained. The bones, though weathered and fragile, bore subtle signs of trauma. A fracture in Jason's skull suggested a blow from a blunt object, perhaps a rock or a heavy piece of equipment. Several ribs showed unnatural breaks, though it was difficult to determine whether they had occurred before or after death. No bullet holes were present, and no sharp force injuries could be identified. This suggested a violent struggle, one rooted in proximity and desperation rather than premeditated weaponry. The camera provided the most haunting clue. Investigators analyzed the photographs frame by frame, reconstructing Jason's final movements. The image of Jason's bruised face, wide-eyed and fearful, hinted that he was aware of danger before the fatal blow. The blurred figure of Tom in the background spoke volumes. Though not conclusive on its own, combined with the burial site, it painted a picture of betrayal that was difficult to dispute. Speculation about motive quickly surfaced. Some pointed to jealousy. Friends recalled how Jason seemed to be thriving in recent years, saving money, planning his future, and pursuing new opportunities. Tom, by contrast, had drifted between jobs, often relying on Jason's generosity. Could resentment have simmered beneath the surface, finally boiling over during their trip? Others believed money played a role. There were whispers that Jason had come into a modest inheritance and that Tom, struggling financially, might have seen the trip as an opportunity. A confrontation could have erupted, escalating from harsh words to fatal violence. The wilderness provided both the isolation and the cover. No witnesses, no cameras, no one to intervene. There was also the possibility of something far more personal: betrayal of trust. Jason and Tom had known each other for years, but relationships are complex, and secrets often lie hidden beneath the surface. Investigators explored whether there had been conflict over women, debts, or unspoken grievances. Each theory added another layer to the story, though none could fully explain the cold calculation required to bury a friend beneath stones and return home to weave a tale of grief. Psychologists later suggested that Tom's ability to insert himself so convincingly into the role of a grieving friend reflected a chilling detachment. To stand beside Jason's family, to create a documentary memorializing him, to relive the story again and again, this was not only deception, but performance. It required an extraordinary ability to suppress guilt, or perhaps an absence of it altogether. Skeptics, however, raised questions of their own. Could it have been a tragic accident after all? Could Tom have panicked, choosing to hide Jason's body out of fear that he would be blamed? Some argued that the stacked rocks might not have been a calculated cover-up, but an impulsive, irrational act born from shock. Yet the presence of the photograph, the one that showed Jason alive, aware, and terrified, made this explanation increasingly difficult to believe. Ultimately, the theories circled back to the same haunting truth. Jason Clark had died not because of Yellowstone's wilderness, but because of human darkness. Whether driven by greed, envy, or rage, Tom had returned from that trip alone, carrying with him a lie so convincing it endured for nearly 10 years. The Clark family, confronted with this reality, were left not only to mourn Jason, but also to grapple with the crushing betrayal of a man they had once embraced as one of their own. The silence of 9 years had finally been broken, but the answers it revealed only deepened the wound. When the truth about Jason Clark finally surfaced, it did not bring peace. Closure, perhaps, but not peace. His family now had a grave to visit, yet the knowledge that Jason's final moments were filled not with the terror of nature but with betrayal by a trusted friend made the pain even sharper. It was no longer just a story of loss. It was a story of cruelty, deception, and years of lies woven into the fabric of their grief. Tom Harris was no longer the grieving companion he had pretended to be. He was now seen as the architect of the very tragedy he had wept over in public. For years he had stood beside Jason's parents, comforted his sister, and looked the world in the eye with a mask of sorrow. That mask had finally slipped, revealing something far darker beneath. The discovery left the community shaken. If someone could play the role of a loyal friend so convincingly, who else might hide such darkness behind a familiar smile? Jason's story serves as a grim reminder of two truths. First, that wilderness itself is dangerous enough. Yellowstone has claimed lives before, and will again. Its cliffs, rivers, and wildlife do not forgive mistakes. But second, and more chilling, is the realization that sometimes the greatest danger is not the environment, but the company we keep. Betrayal from within can be far deadlier than any storm or predator. The Clark family has since spoken publicly about Jason's life, choosing to remember not only the horror of his death, but also the warmth of the man he was. They share his laughter, his kindness, and his adventurous spirit with others, hoping that his legacy will not be defined only by the way he died. And yet, the image of Jason's final photograph, the fear in his eyes, the silent plea frozen in time, remains etched in the minds of all who have heard his story. For those who venture into Yellowstone or into any wilderness, Jason's fate is a warning. Respect nature, prepare carefully, and never underestimate its dangers. But his story also carries another warning, one that echoes far beyond the park's borders. Trust is precious, fragile, and sometimes misplaced. In the end, the rocks by the stream kept Jason's secret for 9 years. When they finally gave it back to the world, they reminded us that truth cannot be buried forever. If this story touched you, please support Last Seen by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you haunting mysteries and stories of those who vanished, only to be remembered years later.